Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to Pearl Harbor in World War II for the story of the battleships at their moorings. A longer print edition with fact sheets and photos is available on LinkedIn or by email.
Just after dawn on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor seemed like any other quiet Sunday in peacetime Hawaii. Battleships lay moored in orderly lines along Ford Island, their gray hulls reflected in still water, and signal flags hanging slack in the mild breeze. On Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, and the other big ships, sailors were coming off watch, thinking about breakfast, chapel, or a slow morning. Hatches clanged, voices drifted across decks, and the routine felt familiar enough that almost no one expected the next few hours to change the world.
Over Oahu, however, Imperial Japanese Navy pilots were already inbound. Torpedo bombers descended through scattered clouds and lined up on the harbor approaches, adjusting speed and altitude for weapons designed to run in shallow water. Dive bombers and high-level bombers followed with target photos and clear orders. Below, lookouts saw aircraft overhead, and for a few fateful moments, many assumed they were friendly planes or training flights. The first explosions ended that illusion. Low-flying aircraft roared over the harbor, and torpedoes splashed into the water, racing toward anchored battleships in long white wakes. Men stared in disbelief for a heartbeat before alarms screamed through steel passageways. Arizona's forward magazine erupted in a towering fireball that tore through the ship, while Oklahoma rolled after repeated torpedo hits. West Virginia, California, and other ships were struck or threatened as smoke, oil, fire, and confusion swallowed Battleship Row. To understand why those minutes mattered, we have to pull back from the flames and look at the Pacific in late 1941. The United States Pacific Fleet was the main visible check on Japanese expansion across East Asia and the Pacific. The battleships at Pearl Harbor were symbols as well as weapons, meant to show that if Japan pushed too far, American heavy steel could respond. Washington had moved the fleet from the West Coast to Hawaii, partly as a warning. That position looked strong on paper, but it carried risks. Many American leaders still imagined that war would come with diplomatic warning, mobilization, and time to deploy. The battleships moored along Ford Island were powerful, but they were also anchored close together with little room to maneuver and deep dependence on shore facilities. Around them stood airfields, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, fuel tanks, drydocks, shops, and communications nodes. If that network collapsed, the Pacific War would begin with the United States pushed far back. Japan saw the fleet from the opposite angle. Its leaders had committed to a broad offensive aimed at seizing resource-rich territories and building a defensive perimeter. The Pacific Fleet was the biggest immediate obstacle to that plan. If American battleships could be sunk or crippled at their moorings, Japanese forces would have time to surge south and west before the United States could react. Pearl Harbor was not just a raid. It was an attempt to redraw the Pacific balance in a single blow. The road to that morning ran through years of rising tension. During the 1930s, Japan pushed deeper into China and looked toward European colonies in Southeast Asia for oil, rubber, and other resources. The United States responded with increasing economic pressure, including restrictions on oil exports that Japanese leaders viewed as an existential threat. Diplomacy continued, but both sides prepared for the possibility that negotiations would fail.
That created a dangerous gap between conversation and action. In Washington, officials still hoped pressure might restrain Japan or force compromise. In Tokyo, many leaders believed time was running out before fuel shortages weakened their freedom of action. The same cables and diplomatic notes could therefore mean very different things to each side. To one side, negotiations were still underway. American war plans still assumed time to mobilize and fleets that would meet at sea. Japanese naval planners imagined something different. They believed carrier air power could strike deep, shock the enemy, and buy time for conquest. Pilots trained for long-range navigation, shallow-water torpedo drops, dive bombing, and high-altitude attacks against ships at anchor. Torpedoes were modified so they would not dive too deep in Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers crossed the North Pacific under radio silence. American intelligence saw hints of danger, but not the exact blow. Messages were intercepted, warnings went out, and commanders in Hawaii were told to watch for hostile moves and sabotage. Yet a carrier strike directly against Pearl Harbor still seemed unlikely to many officers. Radar was new, anti-aircraft defenses were not fully manned on a quiet weekend, and aircraft sat exposed at airfields. Even when individual warnings made sense in isolation, they did not combine into a clear picture soon enough. Diplomats in Washington were still trading notes while the strike force closed the distance. Shortly before 8 in the morning, the first wave divided into its assigned tasks. Torpedo bombers skimmed low into the harbor. Dive bombers rolled into steep attacks. High-level bombers aimed at larger targets, while other aircraft hit Oahu's airfields to keep American fighters on the ground. The plan was to cripple the fleet and its air cover before defenders could fully respond. It was carefully sequenced, with the opening blows meant to create shock, destroy aircraft before they could launch, and leave ships too damaged or confused to fight back effectively. On the ships, the attack became intensely personal. Torpedoes tore into Oklahoma and West Virginia, opening compartments to the sea. Oklahoma capsized as water poured in faster than damage control teams could fight it. Arizona's magazine explosion became one of the lasting images of the attack. Nevada managed to get steam up and move, but Japanese aircraft targeted her as she tried to reach open water. Sailors who had expected breakfast found themselves in darkness, oil-covered water, flooded passageways, and gun mounts that had gone from peacetime readiness to combat in minutes. The defense did not remain frozen. Anti-aircraft crews broke open ammunition lockers and began filling the sky with fire. Some guns were properly sighted, while others fired by eye and instinct. At shore stations, personnel dragged machine guns into position. A few American fighters managed to get airborne from surviving fields, climbing into a sky crowded with smoke and attacking aircraft. By the time the second wave arrived, the defenders were wounded, furious, and far more alert. Damage control became its own battle inside the battle. Crews fought flooding in dark compartments, tried to isolate fires, and searched for trapped shipmates while the attack still continued overhead. Oil on the water caught fire in places, turning escape into another danger for sailors blown or forced overboard. Communications were uneven, and commanders had to act with incomplete information, but the instinct to save ships and lives took hold almost immediately. The second wave added more damage, but it faced a harder fight. Japanese aircraft struck ships, airfields, and facilities, yet some were shot down over the harbor and island. The entire attack lasted only a few hours, but for those under it, the morning felt endless. When the last planes turned away, smoke rose over Battleship Row, fuel burned on the water, and crews began counting the cost without yet knowing which parts of the fleet had survived. For all the destruction, the attack did not deliver everything Japanese planners had hoped. The American battleships at Ford Island were sunk or battered, but the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were not there. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea, and Saratoga was on the west coast.
Japanese crews could only hit what they found. The survival of those carriers would shape every major Pacific battle that followed.
Other crucial targets also remained largely intact. The fuel tank farms near the harbor survived. So did much of the dry dock capacity, machine shops, and submarine base. If those facilities had been destroyed, Pearl Harbor might have been unusable as a forward base, forcing the Navy to operate much farther east. Fuel, repair capacity, spare parts, and submarine support did not look as dramatic as battleships, but they determined whether the harbor could keep functioning. Instead, the backbone of the harbor remained usable. That quiet fact made recovery possible.
This mattered because the Pacific is a war of distance. Every mile east that the United States had been pushed would have lengthened voyages, delayed repairs, and complicated every movement toward the Central and Western Pacific. Keeping Pearl Harbor in operation gave the Navy a damaged but vital springboard. The attack wounded the fleet, but it did not remove the base from the war.
Once immediate rescue work eased, salvage and repair began. Sailors, yard workers, and engineers moved across wrecked decks and flooded compartments to see what could be saved. Ships that looked lost on December 7th were later refloated, patched, and sent to mainland yards for reconstruction. Some returned to combat, their scars hidden under new armor and paint. The Pacific Fleet could not be rebuilt overnight, but the industrial foundation for rebuilding had survived.
The human response also kept disaster from becoming even worse. Men fought fires, carried wounded shipmates, worked pumps, cut into capsized hulls, and kept guns firing under impossible conditions. On Oklahoma, trapped sailors hammered from inside, while rescuers cut from outside. Small boats pulled survivors from oil-slicked water. These acts did not erase the loss, but they saved lives and preserved fighting capability.
The political consequences moved quickly. On December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan with overwhelming support. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, tying the Pacific attack directly to the global war already raging in Europe and North Africa. Pearl Harbor became the doorway through which the United States entered World War II as a fully committed power.
Mobilization followed at remarkable speed. Draft calls expanded, factories shifted from civilian goods to wartime production, and training centers filled with new recruits. The shock of Pearl Harbor was deep, but it was matched by a national decision to fight at a scale the Axis powers had not fully anticipated. Families, factories, shipyards, and training commands were pulled into the same national effort. The harbor that had been caught unprepared became a forward base for a long campaign across the Pacific.
Pearl Harbor also reshaped American naval doctrine. The damage to battleships at anchor exposed the danger of concentrating ships without adequate air warning and air defense. The survival of carriers and submarines accelerated a shift toward carrier task forces and undersea campaigns as central tools of Pacific strategy. Radar networks, readiness procedures, anti-aircraft defenses, and joint coordination all received new urgency. The old image of battleships deciding the Pacific by lining up for a gun duel did not disappear overnight, but it no longer dominated the future. Aircraft, scouting, logistics, and speed became the center of the story.
Today, Pearl Harbor remains a central case study in surprise, intelligence warning, operational readiness, and resilience. The image of burning battleships still speaks to the cost of complacency and the human toll of unpreparedness. It also marks the moment when a peacetime fleet began its transformation into a wartime navy that would cross the Pacific, island by island, and battle by battle.
The Japanese attack was meant to buy time and discourage American intervention. Instead, it galvanized a vast industrial nation, preserved enough tools for a new naval strategy, and tied the United States fully to the global fight. Pearl Harbor began in peace and flame, but its legacy reaches far beyond that morning, into every discussion of warning, readiness,
and the terrible speed with which history can change.